my mother is a retired attorney in Contra Costa County, and I did work with family law section for like 18 years. So I've been around and involved, you know, on the outskirts of the spectacular, but it's my first from 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning till this evening, and it's been a fantastic day. As I did this afternoon, kudos to the bar staff that put this together, the section leaders, the volunteers, absolutely amazing. What you all have done, the speakers who volunteered your time to share information and again, encourage generation of ideas and networking has been fantastic. Wanted to invite those of you who may not have had a chance. We do still have some of the Judge Cordell's books in the back for a contribution of $20 if you would like that. She graced us with an extra time and personally signed each and every one of the books, so you would have a signed copy, which is really cool. And so I also wanted to make sure, once again, that I'm not going to read through the sponsors this time, to thank our sponsors for today. We have a banner in the back that outlines, and all of your programs should show the sponsors that help us put this program together. One more thing before we head into the plenary session. If I could have the representatives of Congress of Neutrals, Debbie, and then also Jonathan from Keynote. Yeah, see, I'm terrible. I can't see. Come on up. We had that raffle I was telling you all about. Let's see. Do you want to go ahead and get it first?
What raffle?
Just have a raffle of $200 gift card to Fleming's Steakhouse.
Oh, nice. Wait.
Oh, yeah.
No. Run up with your
If he calls your name, they're gonna riot.
I can throw him 15 just one.
It's not us, it's a double picture one.
Oh, this is law offices of Ariel Burrell?
Yeah.
I call foul.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll accept it for her. I'm gonna leave.
Somebody else.
We think.
Don't they gotta be here to get it?
Yeah.
That must be here. Must be present.
Hi, good afternoon. Deborah Levy, the Executive Director of the Congress of Neutrals. And thank you all who stopped by our table and put in a card. We also have, just to let you know, this is for a bottle of wine, just for your business card. We are also asking for a donation to our nonprofit, which we serve the county court with mediation for free to litigants. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website. And anyone who does a $50 donation or more will be entered in our raffle for not only a bottle of wine, but a gift certificate to Bada Wine Bar. Yeah. So please come. If you need any information about our website, it's www.congressneutrals.org. Easy to find. Okay. I think Daphne's one of our mediators extraordinaire.
All right.
Okay, this is Shola Moore. Yeah, you know who you are?
Not yet.
I think for this one you need to be present.
Yes.
There you go. Must be present. We could be here a while.
Okay, Martin Gonzalez. Did he left? Okay. Okay, keep going.
All right, 3 strikes.
One so hard. Oh, it's
Okay.
Okay. Those of you who've been with me all day understand some words just, my tongue does not like that. So Natasha joined the Tahari firm in 2021. She is an immigration attorney in the San Francisco Bay Area office, providing legal counsel and representation to immigrant women and girls who are survivors of gender-based violence. For this firm, she has worked 7 years, prior to this firm, she worked for 7 years as the regulatory due diligence analyst. I need more caffeine. At Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Banking, handling and advising on risk and compliance issues for derivative trading. And it would also be helpful if I didn't have so many complicated words. Really, I did go to college. I was an English major, and you would never know it by my work today. My goodness gracious. Natasha felt called to be an advocate for women and girls who suffered violence based on their gender. Preceding Wells Fargo, she worked as an immigration attorney at Fellow and Solario in San Francisco, a San Francisco-based firm that handles a wide spectrum of immigration issues, and as a volunteer immigration attorney for Catholic Charities. She was a judicial clerk for the Honorable Justo Arenas of the U.S. District Court of Puerto Rico. She was also a contributing author of Moore's Answer Guide, Federal Discovery Practice in 2009, and Moore's Answer Guide, Federal Civil Motion Practice in 2009. She has traveled abroad extensively, as you can probably gather, and will be presenting a fabulous program today on trauma-informed lawyering. On behalf of the Bar Association, we'd like to give to her Justice Marciano, many of you may know, wrote Stories from the Gray Building, and we provided a gift of this morning, and for our lunch speaker, and of course for Natasha today. So please join me in welcoming Natasha.
Thank you, everyone. Just going to get the PowerPoint ready to go. I want to thank Contra Costa Bar Association for inviting Tahari to give our presentation today on trauma-informed lawyering. I know I won't be able to follow Judge Cordell, but I will do my best to not make you fall asleep. And hopefully you will be able to learn a little bit of how to incorporate trauma-informed practices into your actual legal practice. So the agenda today is, one, just going to introduce you to Tahari Justice Center. We are a fairly new office in the Bay Area, but we are actually a national nonprofit with 4 other offices. And today we're going to be identifying trauma, what is trauma-informed lawyering, and other things to consider. And so I wanted to start you off with a quick 6.5-minute video that just describes the justice system. For transparency purposes, I do want to let you know that it will discuss gender-based violence, so if that's not your thing and you want to step out, you can do that. Come back and join us in 6.5 minutes.
Life began in Togo, Africa, where female genital cutting has been practiced for generations. She refused to submit to the custom or to follow through on becoming one of 4 wives to a man nearly 3 times her age.
Technical difficulties. I'm just trying to make the volume higher. Okay, well, that's as good as we can get. So,
Each of us enter the world
trying to-
with a set of basic hopes and dreams. Expecting a life of safety, dignity, and freedom. What happens next depends on circumstances beyond our control. For Fazia Kasija, life began in Togo, Africa, where female genital cutting has been practiced for generations. She refused to submit to the custom or to follow through on becoming one of 4 wives to a man nearly 3 times her age.
When my aunt told me she had arranged my marriage and that I was to be cut, I was terrified.
Fazia escaped just hours before she was to undergo the procedure, leaving behind the family and life she loved to make her way to America. Laylee Miller Muro, a young law student at the time, was part of the legal team that fought alongside Fazia, taking her case all the way to the highest U.S. immigration court, where they won a groundbreaking decision that set a national precedent and set the wheels in motion. 25 years of progress and perseverance in support of gender-based asylum as Tahoe Justice Center was born. Fazia's triumph made it possible for others facing severe gender-based harms to seek safety in the United States.
My ex-husband was truly violent. I lived with him for 20 years, and I reported him to police and began a long journey of finding a safe and stable life for me and my kids.
My family is from one of the richest ethnic groups in Mali, so I was able to travel the world and study in the United States. But my family completely shut me out when I refused to quit school and go home. I faced a horrible choice between being cut and marrying a man twice my age, or being physically and emotionally harmed just for standing up for myself.
Desde los 2005, en clases de inglés, conocí a mi expareja. En ese mismo año empezamos una relación y cuando teníamos 2 meses de noviazgo empezó la violencia. Mi sufrimiento comenzó con 2 cachetadas. Por más de 3 años luché por salir adelante con mi hija, pero en el 2011 por fin busqué ayuda y llamé a la policía después de un incidente muy feo.
The stories of perseverance and courage go on and on. Over the past 25 years, Taha Ray has answered more than 31,000 calls for help. In the past 10 years alone, we've touched the lives of more than 100,000 people through our training and outreach, and built a pro bono network of more than 2,800 professionals who, along with our staff, provide free legal and social services of all kinds: food, emergency shelter, counseling, medical services, employment services, and so much more, so that survivors can begin healing from trauma and have the means to support themselves and their family. And we have grown from a 3-room office in the basement of a medical building to a national organization serving survivors at 5 locations around the country.
I looked for someone who can help me for over a year without any success. I had almost lost hope when I finally learned about Ahari. They spoke my language, they understood my experience, and they knew how to help. In just a few months, I was able to get legal and social assistance, which helped me with my asylum status, finish my education, and work.
It took years to work things out, but Tahiti has been my side through it all, connecting us with healthcare and other services, helping us to get passport and visa staging. It's been hard, but my kids and I are safe now. Por medio de una persona contacté a Tahiti y desde ese momento cambió mi vida. Ellos me ayudaron muchísimo a legalizar mi estatus migratorio. Gracias a Dios mi vida cambió, porque puedo conseguir un buen trabajo y darle una mejor vida a mis hijas.
Agradezco a Tahiti por su apoyo.
Over our 25-year history, Taha Ray has had our fingerprints on some of the most significant gender justice developments.
Fazia's wedding case helped make female genital cutting illegal in the United States.
We work with the U.S. government to help establish and strengthen pathways to immigration status for survivors of human trafficking and serious crimes. We've been leaders in ending child marriage in America. We were one of the first organizations to call for the explicit inclusion of gender as a ground for asylum.
When we linked arms with immigrant survivors on their journey to justice, we were inspired to change the laws and policies that allow gender-based violence to continue, and to build a world in which everyone can live a life in safety and with dignity. We remember
that we are one. We are one in our humanity. We remember that we are one in our humanity.
Taha Ray Justice Center stands firm in the belief that none of us is free from violence and fear until all of us are. Please join us in creating the world we all deserve.
So, what is trauma? You're probably saying, well, you just saw this video. I think I kind of get the gist of what trauma is. But trauma actually manifests itself in many different forms. The word trauma is actually a Greek word, which just means wound. In ancient Greek, it was just a physical wound. Nowadays, we actually talk about trauma, and you're more likely to hear about trauma in an emotional sense, an emotional wound. So traumatic events can involve threats of life or bodily integrity, or a close personal encounter with violence or death. The word trauma can, like I said before, be considered physical, but also emotionally painful, distressing, that prevents someone from overcoming what has happened to them. In psychological terms, traumatic events traditionally have been considered those that harm the psychological integrity of an individual, making them feel helpless, involving a sense of horror, serious injury, and even can lead to threat of serious injury or death. And trauma and traumatic events also include personal and private experiences, as well as public experiences. So you might say, I think I kind of know what personal and private experiences are. As you see from the video, there are survivors that have been victims of sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, child abuse, but it also includes other things. It includes unexpected death of a loved one, dealing with a life-threatening illness. Now, what can be a little bit more tricky is examples of public trauma, but I promise you know what public trauma is. It can include war, terrorism, natural disasters, community violence, dislocation or displacement of people from their country or home, racism, public health crisis, aka COVID, and many, many more. Now, what's interesting, I find interesting, is that sometimes public trauma can also be personal trauma. For example, with the instance of COVID, I think the world was pretty much traumatized seeing it on the news, and everywhere you look, there's this uptick of numbers with COVID. But some of us might have been also hit hard at home. Maybe we had a loved one who had COVID that went into the hospital. Maybe they died. So that's just a kind of example of how those can actually cross into one another. So you might also say, well, with all these examples of trauma, it seems that anything could be trauma. Or more likely, everybody might be affected by trauma at a certain point in their life. And you would be somewhat correct. The World Health Organization did a mental health survey in 2017 of nearly 70,000 adults from 24 different countries. And it's ranging from economic status from high to low. And what they found is that 70.4 respondents actually experienced trauma, at least one type of trauma in their lifetime. So with experiencing all this type of trauma, you may also say, okay, well, what's the impact? There's obvious impacts here. I have a cute little diagram of brain that's kind of spitting out all these different factors of the impacts of trauma. There's anxiety, there's PTSD, which we're all kind of familiar with. There's fear, there's being on edge, there's hypervigilance. So all these different things might actually affect trauma, might be the impact of trauma on your life if you happen to experience trauma firsthand, or if your client actually has experienced trauma firsthand. Fun fact I like to geek out sometimes. Trauma actually impacts three primary brain regions, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And just to give you an understanding of what it really impacts is, for instance, the prefrontal cortex, that's where we do our problem solving, that's where we do our planning, that's where our personality is developed. Our amygdala is where we do our decision making. That's where we hold our emotional memories. It helps us regulate our behavior. The hippocampus, that's where there's memory consolidation and where we have navigational and spatial memory and how we learn. So it actually impacts a lot. I have on the slide here as well as other impacts of trauma that may occur. Now, the impact of trauma is different on every person. Thank you. The impact of trauma is different on every person. What someone else feels might not be the same thing as another person will feel. So, but this is just kind of a little guide to kind of show you what might happen, what others might be experiencing. There might be a loss of safety, a loss of danger cues, which basically means they have been traumatized so much that the traumatization is their new normal. They don't know when they're in danger. There is loss of trust, shame, loss of intimacy, and then disassociation. Also loss of physical connectiveness with their own body. They just kind of shut down. And loss of sense of self, loss of self-worth, and also reenactment. Doing the same thing or reliving the event over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. So, how might trauma complicate the client interviewing process? Well, it can lead to you're in a meeting with the client and they shut down. You're just asking about normal basic things and you can't get them to talk to you about something that's just minor. It might also be that the client relives the trauma while discussing it with you in your office. This can lead to dire situations sometimes as well. So it's good to kind of be able to spot if they're going down that rabbit hole. A client may have an inappropriate reaction when discussing trauma. For instance, laughing while talking about a rape. Complete lack of effect, which actually affects their credibility. And clients may suffer from panic attacks during an interview actually while testifying. Clients may hallucinate during an interview. Or clients may become angry or defiant towards attorneys or anyone else in an authority type figure, and incapable of recognizing the consequences of their conduct. So you might be asking, why is this important to my practice? I can see how it's important to Tahare's practice, but how is this important to mine? And I would say that it's important because trauma doesn't just isn't just with organizations like Tahere. It's in everyday life, as we kind of talked about before. And so that means that when your client is coming into your office, you never know what they're going through. And so the point is to meet them where they are and to identify if you're seeing signs of trauma and if that's affecting their case with you. So the first part is client trust and engagement. It's important because it helps you to understand your client and how to better engage with them. Attorney-client interactions. By doing this, it will help you to, by engaging with them, it will better help you to have better interactions with your client. It also helps with modeling positive relationships, which means you as an attorney are authority figure, whether you like it or not. So you setting boundaries and showing them what a positive relationship is will actually help them help you with the things that you're asking for, and also help them in their life as well. Better advocacy, that's the kind of obvious choice. If you're able to get your client to trust you and to engage with you, and you can get better interactions with you, you'll be a better advocate for them because you'll be able to get the information that you need. So what is trauma-informed lawyering? So the hallmarks of trauma-informed lawyering is just kind of what we kind of talked about. It's basically putting your client first, understanding that, oh, they're dealing with trauma, and finding a way and changing your approach to them in a way that can best help your relationship with them and your interactions with them. So the hallmarks of trauma-informed lawyering is one, identifying trauma, and you do not have to be an expert. We are lawyers. You didn't go to school. I didn't go to school to actually do this. But you don't have to be an expert. You can learn about common responses that clients might have when they're dealing with trauma, and that will better equip you with actually spotting when a client's getting nervous about a situation, if they're really kind of reacting kind of out of the norm than what you expect a client to act. You might be dealing with a client that is dealing with trauma. The next one is patience. You're going to get a lot of it. And that just might mean that you might have to kind of change up your routine. You might not get everything in that one meeting with your client. So you might have to anticipate that and be able to kind of maneuver and set up additional meetings with them. Role definitions and boundaries is another hallmark of trauma-informed practice, which basically means that you're dealing with someone who has constantly had their boundaries pushed. And so they don't know how to relate to you. They don't know when they've crossed the line. So it's up to you to kind of model that for them and to set boundaries for yourself and for them as well. And so an example of that I would like to say is kind of like, if you leave a message, expect a call within 24 or 72 hours. You don't have to call 10 times. I got the first message, I'll get back to you. So the next one is preparing for and responding to triggers. So once you know that your client is dealing with trauma, you can adjust your strategy accordingly to that particular client. For example, do shorter appointments. I like to do a sandwiching method, which is basically, if I know that I'm going to have to talk to a client about something very difficult, I start off the meeting with something very pleasant. And then I put in the difficult part, and then I end the meeting with something very pleasant to get their mind away from what we discussed. You might even think about doing multiple appointments. Another example is, what if the client is withdrawn? For that, you would need to gain a sense of trust and safety with that client, and that might take multiple appointments actually, just so that they can feel comfortable enough with you, opening up and sharing what they're experiencing. The opposite spectrum is flooding, which is basically a client becomes so highly emotional, you just ask about, okay, where do you live? And then they launch into a 15-minute scenario of how they move from place to place. And you're just asking, okay, I just need your address right now. So a good way to kind of prepare that is always kind of nicely stop the client and just kind of getting the focus back on the task at hand. And it might take some practice with doing that. Another thing is adapting legal strategies. So if you have to testify, if your client has to testify, you might want to work with your client on desensitizing them, which means basically rehearsing a lot. Now you might be saying, that seems kind of counterintuitive. I don't want to re-traumatize my client. But I guarantee you, you're going to re-traumatize them if you don't prepare them if they have to testify. So it might mean that you might do it in chunks. You might add on extra sessions where you're preparing to help desensitize the client and help them with their testimony. You also might want to enlist the support of mental health providers or partner with someone else, another support person that you know is there for them. Could be a family member that they trust and they confide in. That way they would have an outlet after you have a meeting with them to discuss what happened, what feelings that are coming up, and help push the bad feelings out of their head, and not so that they're not constantly thinking about the trauma. Now, if a client is a complete mess, you might want to search for ways in which you can get evidence on the record. For example, reaching out to the other side to see if you can stipulate to certain facts. You might even go the mediation route instead of actually going into court. Or you might even think about doing a psychological evaluation, which means bringing in an expert to kind of do a test on your client and then also be a witness while you're in court. Another hallmark of trauma-informed modeling is being honest and transparent. You don't have the answers. You don't know how. You might know some of the side effects, but you can be honest and transparent of, I know that you're going through trauma and I'm here for you the best way that I can. And work with the client together. And the last and most important one is preventing vicarious trauma. Oftentimes, people who are impacted by trauma are those that are actually helping those who have been impacted by trauma, which we call secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. So finding ways that will help balance your life as well so that you aren't left with the feeling that you're feeling traumatized. So how can I help my clients now? Well, one way is to be predictable. Keep a routine with the client once you know that they have been affected by trauma in some way. This can be explain things in advance. Let them know, hey, the next meeting, we're going to need to discuss some hard things. So you can let them know specifics. I want to delve in a little bit more about what happened to you on this date when this incident occurred. Offer options in physical space, such as permission to close the door. Have tissues at the ready. Be mindful about note-taking. I know a lot of times in my practice that clients, I generally tell them, hey, I'm going to be taking notes. I'm not ignoring you, but there will be times that I do have to take notes, and having that constant reminder kind of helps them. It actually kind of helps, I think, ground them as well, because they know that that's that time that they can just stop and kind of reflect and calm down. Give them space. So remind clients that they can ask for breaks and stop when it's necessary. Now sometimes you might offer this and the client might not take it. They might seem okay, but I always think it's a good practice that even though they think they're okay, it's good to offer it instead. I kind of use it in a sense of, you know what, you might not need a break, but I need a break. I'm going to get some water. Do you want some water? And you can also facilitate self-soothing while you're in a meeting with a client, and that's just basically something that kind of uses their hands, gets their mind off of discussing this difficult topic. You can include stress balls. There are coloring books. Nice little tip is that Word actually has free coloring book templates. So you can actually download that, have that at the ready for them. Or you can even just take a break and say, hey, let's go for a walk. Let's just, leave this behind and go for a walk. Or another way is to actually learn about breathing exercises that you can do with your client. This is especially helpful if your client has a tendency to relive the trauma. Kind of help, the breathing exercises kind of helps them to kind of focus and grounds them. Be cognizant of the language you use. Avoid language that is, oh, you're being oversensitive. Stay away from language that sounds judgmental, because you want to make it a safe space for the client to actually tell you what's going on in their life. Name what the client is dealing with in its trauma. And sometimes, surprisingly enough, actually, some clients don't know that they're dealing with trauma. So when you bring it up, it kind of is like a release for them to say, oh, okay, I'm not overreacting. Acknowledge when, like I said before, an upcoming interview or meeting is going to be hard. That kind of helps grounds them and helps them prepare. And then reassure your client that all the information will be kept confidential. We know that, we're attorneys, but sometimes I still have to remind my clients that. And provide reciprocity. Give what you want to receive. If you want your client to listen, be a good listener. And then be kind and patient and empathetic. Set limits and boundaries. Because again, you're going to be modeling good, positive relationships. And you don't want to kind of overextend yourself as well. So how to work with vulnerable populations. I just wanted to kind of get into this because depending on the situation at hand, you might just be in a meeting with a client and they let you know that they are still in danger and that they're still with their abuser. So you might want to create a safety plan. And a safety plan is just a word, just basically means brainstorming ways of how to stay safe, making a plan for that. If X happens, then you're going to do Y and Z. And it kind of helps, empowers the client. It gives them the tools at hand of what to do the next time an abuser does something to them, and they don't feel so alone. Also, familiarize yourself with the power and control wheels. These are very helpful. There are a couple that are popular. There's the DallasModel.org and there's Hotline.org also has like a power and control wheels. And basically those are helpful tools with understanding the overall pattern of abusive and violent behaviors, which an abuser might use to establish and maintain control over their partner. And then also establish some procedures for your office if you don't have them already. A lot of times when you're dealing with a domestic abuse and other types of abuse, abusers actually might come to your office. So it's a good way to actually make a plan in case something else like that happens. Now, if a client has restrictions, for instance, they might not be allowed to go out at certain times. They only maybe can call you between the hours of 3 to 4 or 8 to 9. That's because that's when their abuser is gone. Make sure you get that information and make a plan of how you can safely communicate with that client. And there are a couple different even linguistic and cultural considerations as well to consider. There's language. So what is your client's first language? So if their first language isn't English, even though they might be fluent, still take that into consideration. Because their language, their dominant language is going to have a base. And their language, maybe with English, might have a base as well, which basically means they can understand, they can talk to you fluently in English, but complicated terms they might not necessarily get. So in those cases, you might want to enlist a translator. And be careful of who that translator is as well. If their translator is their abuser, that kind of complicates things. And so if you can have someone that's independent, that's a better way to go. And there's also culture and lost in translation. So many terms are not easily explained, even in English, right? Talking to someone who's not an attorney about court hearings, NTAs and specifics about forms of relief can be very hard. You kind of have to put it in layman's terms. It's the same thing if you're dealing with a client that actually English isn't their first language. Even kind of harder sometimes because they might not even know that in their first language in the first place. So you're kind of having to explain it very newly to them. Also take into account to regional differences. This is especially true with using translators. So, for instance, there are many different dialects in the same language. Spanish is widely used here in the U.S., but there are certain dialect differences depending on what countries you come from. You know, coat can mean so many different words in Spanish, and you might be saying something to someone and they're like, that is not the word for that. I don't understand what you're saying. So just kind of be cognizant of that and be ready to clarify. And then what about the client's culture? I know in some cultures it's difficult to actually, people are taught to actually not look people in the eye. So don't take that as a sign of disrespect. It could just be that that's their culture. So a great way to deal with being trauma informed is partnering and doing some collaboration. If you yourself do not have the ability to take care of a client the way that you think you should, at least familiarize yourself with certain centers in the area, certain crisis centers, shelters, other organizations that might be able to help your client, especially when they bring it up and you're practicing an area of law that doesn't help your client in the matter of what they're dealing with right now. Thinking about reaching out to or collaborating with caseworkers, social workers, at least having referrals for therapists or a way for them to find a therapist. 911, reiterating that they should call 911. And understanding their support system if they actually come out to you and tell you that they are have experienced trauma or still in an abusive situation. So, what are the challenges for doing empathetic work? Burnout. I think we all deal with burnout on a regular basis. You don't have to think of trauma for that, but that's one of the things that are that hit hard when you're doing empathetic work, even more so. There's counter-transference, which is basically you let your own feelings shape the way you interact with or react to your client. And then there's vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, which refers to working empathetically with and feeling the responsibility for someone who has survived trauma. So what are examples of trauma, vicarious trauma? Well, these are just a few, not all of them. Alterations to one's sense of self, changes in the worldview about issues like safety, trust, control, changes in spiritual beliefs. And how does this play out in your real life? Well, it may lead to feeling a range of emotions. You might feel angry, you might feel sadness, you might feel bystander guilt, you might distance yourself, you might feel numb or hopelessness. Then there's overextending yourself, which is kind of the other extreme. You're so preoccupied with what's going on with your client that you're over-identifying with the client. You have difficulties maintaining professional boundaries. And then there's avoiding your client, which is also another extreme. Dreading talking to your client because you fear that they're going to bring this up again, this traumatic event that happened to them. Not even listening to your client's story or cutting them off. And then another way of how it plays in real life is expressing an unusual amount of pessimism and then higher levels of stress. So what can we do to reduce the effects of vicarious trauma? So there's one practice that's called reflective practice approach, which is basically regularly engaging in reflection for your individual interactions. That means basically taking in your wins and losses, what might be getting in the way of also your ability to work with your particular client. And a good way to deal with that is, once you figure that out, is putting in short-term and long-term goals of how you're going to deal with this client, how you're going to help them with their case. And also reflect on ways of what can make your life easier. Are there things that you can delegate? Do you have to be the one calling the client all the time? Can you block off time in your calendar after working with the client so that you have time to decompress. Then there's therapeutic self-awareness. Now, one good thing is actually writing down things that you want to remember when you talk to someone. You also might want to learn what your triggers are and vulnerabilities if you find that after your client interaction, you might be dealing or feeling a certain way. A good way is to work with a therapist, but you can also do this work yourself as well. Ask a coworker or friend or partner to remind you of the ways that you're doing a good job and to kind of be your sounding board as well. And most importantly, understanding yourself and knowing your limitations will help you to kind of stop you from taking on too much, especially when you're dealing with a client that hasn't been impacted by trauma. Another way to reduce our strategy is connection, which is, depending on your work environment, it can be to team up with one or more coworkers on a regular basis to go over reflective practice approach. If you're a solo practitioner, you might want to team up with another solo practitioner that can kind of help and support you with that. Or you might want to find a mentor that has dealt with this before and that can give you additional guidance and support with this. Establish healthy habits. Not only is your mind affected by it, but your body as well. So establishing healthy habits of eating right, exercising, is a good way to kind of help balance you out when you're dealing with this. Also, try and learn some types of coping skills that might help you. This might mean using grounding techniques during difficult meetings, like I mentioned before, stress ball, coloring book, certain things like that. Something that gets you using your hands. Or after the meeting, go out and do something that you love to do. Or talk to your favorite cousin. Or go in and take a walk. And also remember about work-life balance. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of attorneys and this is going to go out the window, but it's really important. You are not your work. And then the most important thing really is to cultivate your relationships around you. Now it could be, your attorney friends, or you're going to cultivate your relationship with them, but also just your normal non-attorney friends. Go out, hang out with them. Go out, hang out with your family. Find a hobby if you don't have it. Or if you do have a hobby, dedicate yourself to that hobby. Dedicate some time to get that in, especially when after you have dealt with a long meeting with a client that has proven to be difficult. And then education and training, which is what you guys are doing here, or allowing me to talk to you about today. Invest in opportunities to promote your personal and interpersonal growth, and that will help you better to be ready for dealing with a client that has experienced trauma, and know kind of what steps to take and how to deal with them, but also deal with yourself. And it'll help you notice, like, hey, I feel like I'm getting agitated. I think that meeting actually affected me a lot more than I thought it did. Oh, hey, I'm feeling depressed. I think it's because I've just been kind of working nonstop, and I'm also dealing with this client that's been impacted by trauma. I think that's getting to me. So here are some options. Well, one option for lawyers. I'm sure there's many more. There's therapy, but then also the California Bar has a lawyer's assistance program, and it offers free assessments to not just attorneys. It's actually offered for law students as well, and they give you a free assessment of your situation, and will assist you in getting to counseling or a support group. And some of the short-term services are free. And this doesn't have to be, you're dealing with trauma right now. You can do this now. when, you know, everything in your life is going well, it's always good to check it. So I want to say thank you for allowing me to speak on this very heavy subject. And I hope that you have learned some tools of how you can actually incorporate in your practice when you find yourself with a client that may have experienced trauma, or if you find yourself that you're dealing with vicarious trauma with dealing with that type of client. If you want to know more information about Target Justice Center, I put out the website link there. We have events in the Bay Area, and we also do have pro bono opportunities. Thank you.